All right, we should be live now. Let me double check that real quick. Yes, we are. All right. I am here with the one and only Eli Harman, advocate of propertarianism, and he is here to argue against free speech. He's here to say that free speech is not just wrong, but gay. And I'll be taking the opposite position, and we'll see where things go. Eli, ball's in your court.
Okay, not literally gay, of course, but I think the idea behind free speech, at least as it exists in America or was written into the American Constitution, was that truth is supposed to prevail in the marketplace of ideas, and the best correction to error or even to lies is an open marketplace of ideas where people can expose those errors or those lies for what they are and introduce better ideas. And the theory being that those will win out over time. Other statements that kind of go along in the same vein are like sunlight is the best disinfectant, or there's a quote from Game of Thrones where Tyrion, I believe, says, if you cut out someone's tongue, you only show the world that you fear what he has to say, or something like that. The idea being, that's part of the transformation from a culture of honor, where reputation was something that was fiercely guarded, to a culture of dignity, where people were trying to
pardon the introduction. Were you listening to the Very Bad Wizards podcast where they were talking about this recently?
No, I haven't heard that one.
Okay,
no.
Never mind. Pardon the interruption.
So the transformation from a culture of honor, where things like reputation were strictly guarded or fiercely defended, to a culture of dignity, where you want to show that you're the bigger man, so to speak, by tolerating insults or other kinds of provocative speech. And I don't think this was a terrible idea for the time. This marketplace of ideas idea. It just hasn't worked out that way. We've seen lies proliferate. We've seen lies become entrenched and become institutionalized. And the most obvious and the most pernicious example of that is Marxism. And, Marxism established itself in a number of countries, not in America or in Western European countries, but the cultural variant of Marxism, which is a development of that, has now firmly established itself in Western cultures, including America. And so, the task for us is to explain how this happened and how to reverse it and how to prevent it from happening again. And unfortunately, one of the problems is free speech, that this ideal of free speech obliges us to tolerate the articulation of certain kinds of ideas in certain kinds of ways that there is no benefit to tolerating, ultimately. There's no benefit to tolerating Marxism or propagandistic Marxist styles of speech and expression that are dishonest. To be clear, I'm not necessarily advocating the suppression of political opinions other than my own. I think there are a wide variety of political opinions that can be held and debated and discussed and proposed in an honest and truthful way, as long as you're willing to observe certain principles of like full accounting and full disclosure and stuff like that. And as long as you're willing to be truthful about what you propose or what you prefer, there's a tremendous amount of variety and diversity that people can have in their preferences or their viewpoints that don't necessarily need to be suppressed. We may need to separate. We may need to have separate institutions if our preferences are too different or our views are too different. And that can be either totally separate, like separate sovereignties, or it can be something like federalism, where we have, local subdivisions of, say federated sovereignties. So we may need to separate if our views are too different, but as long as we're truthful and we're honest about what we prefer and what it costs and who bears those costs, and things like that, then there's a tremendous amount of variety we can still tolerate. Where it goes wrong is with Marxism. You have an ideology that, for example, has 100 years of more or less unbroken failure at delivering its promises, very successful at obtaining power, very unsuccessful at delivering on the promises that lead it into power, or that induce people to let it take power, or to fight to give it power. So, tremendous record of failure. All of them, as we are well aware, were not real communism. That's a typically evasive Marxist lie that they use. And they use a variety of propagandistic techniques to push their doctrines and their policies and their platforms. They do a lot of framing, which is where they'll focus very narrowly in on a few select facts that may or may not be true. Sometimes they're outright lies. Sometimes they are true facts. They're just cherry-picked, so to speak. So you're getting a very incomplete picture that suggests conclusions that aren't true and are actually, dangerously false. And then they do a lot of loading, and that's investing, their position or their proposals with a lot of moral and emotional baggage, using, morally and emotionally charged language, words, like, this isn't really Marxist per se, but like property is theft. That would be like a mutualist kind of talking point. And that's an example of loading, where you're taking something that has moral and emotional baggage like theft, and you're conflating it with something else, property, to try and associate those loadings with both things. And that's another one, conflation. Conflation is a pretty common technique of propagandistic deception, where you try to break down the meanings of words and to associate things haphazardly, one with the other, without making a clear distinction. And that's a pretty standard technique. And then overloading, which is repetition, and they do this primarily by, controlling the institutional means of producing and disseminating narratives, right? Whether it's the media or the academy, they predominate in those positions in those institutions, and count on sheer repetition to get their point of view out there and to overcome challengers. And the more they repeat it, flooding the marketplace of ideas with lies, spam, basically, the harder it is for everyone to wade through the crap and to figure out what's really going on, what's really true. And the more time investment it requires, and the more cognitively demanding it is. So, spamming is a tremendously powerful technique for hacking free speech. Just volume and repetition. And there are some others as well. That's not an exhaustive list, but it's a good starting point. And when you see people using these techniques, they're not being honest. They're not being truthful. They're not making a full accounting of costs and benefits. If they're making an incomplete accounting, that leads to what Scott Adams calls a half opinion, where you're looking at the costs but not the benefits, or the benefits but not the costs, or only some subset of each. And you're not going to reach a correct opinion, or if you have a correct opinion, you're not going to convey a correct opinion by that kind of, narrow framing. And so there's not really any point in tolerating these kind of techniques. And others might be the feminine means of coercion, which that's a way of raising the emotional and social cost of disagreement without addressing the points of contention. That would just be like insulting your opponent, or mocking or ridiculing or psychoanalyzing your opponent, or shaming and scolding and nagging. We call those the feminine means of coercion. And so those are not really honest methods of debate, because you can use them to attack anybody, and you can use them to attack any position, and therefore by process of elimination to defend any other. And so there are a variety of these techniques that are not honest, that are not truthful, that are not productive. They're a way of prevailing or getting your way, or advancing your point without actually addressing the controversy or reality or anything relevant. And so it's not worthwhile to tolerate these means. We can tolerate differences of opinion. We can tolerate differences in values or preferences up to a point. Beyond a certain point, we may have to have separate institutions or whatever. But up to a point, we can tolerate it. And even under separate institutions, we can tolerate these differences as long as we're truthful about them. But these various propagandistic and dishonest and parasitic means, rhetorical means, are they're destructive and they're pointless and they're a waste, and there's no benefit to anyone who's not a parasite from tolerating them. And that's my the basic statement of my case.
Okay. Fair enough. I guess I'll start on my case then. I've become less of a free speech absolutist over the years. I used to be a staunch, well, I used to be an absolutist. I used to think you ought to be able to say anything, because the fire in a crowded theater argument was absolute bullshit. But fire in a crowded theater isn't the strongest argument against free speech. The strongest argument against free speech that I'm aware of is libel. And we already have libel laws. So people will say, okay, well, free speech doesn't exist because you're not allowed to say whatever you want about other people if it's false. We have laws against that. And that's true. What we're after, but you can make that same case about freedom generally. You could say, well, we're not free to do otherwise. There is no free will, so what do you care about freedom? And what we're fundamentally after when we talk about freedom of speech or freedom more generally is the experience of agency. And that is something that can be attained within it's much easier within a homogeneous society than not. But the experience of freedom of speech and not being restrained is something that we can achieve even with basic limitations on free speech. And in order to have that experience of free speech that allows you to explore ideas, means cannot be, certain means of expression, modes of expression can't be taken off the table. And what you're arguing here is the classic philosopher's complaint about philosophically untrained people using rhetoric rather than dialectic. Oh, they're using ad hominem fallacies, ad hominem attacks here. Oh, they're conflating terms. They're taking this definition and they're twisting it to mean something else. But as you said at the very beginning, even the presentation of facts, of true facts, can be used to mislead. Our, I'm sure, mutual favorite radio station, National Public Radio, will on occasion do that. They will, I'm sure, accidentally mislead people by presenting facts from one side and not presenting relevant facts that would present another side of the story. They don't do that all the time, I'm sure, but it happens from time to time. So if even the presentation of facts as a means can be used dishonestly and can be used in a way that misleads people and that is harmful, then what means is on the table? What means could possibly be allowed? Now, conflation stuck out to me because I was just listening to a speech by Jack Donovan a couple days ago where he was presenting Nietzsche's argument that power equals freedom equals being loved by the gods equals, and he was taking all these terms and aligning them with each other. So there's clearly a wrong way to use conflation, but sometimes equating words with each other can be used to make powerful and serious points as well. So it all comes down to how they're used, and we both know that humor can be used against our enemy as well as by them. The 2016 election was nothing if not evidence of that, in my opinion. So where does that leave us with the mechanisms? Fundamentally, I think the problem that we're experiencing with Marxism and with leftists and these people is we've got a divergence of conceptions of what the good is in the society. And this divergence of conceptions of the good and this divergence of the type of society we want to live in, which has to do somewhat with whether you're living in cities or living in the country, has something to do with immigration, has something to do with probably some other factors as well.
Gender, ethnicity.
Yeah, we could say universal suffrage probably had an effect on that too. But it's these divergences in interests, and breaking up and cracking down on freedom of speech won't solve that problem. But creating more homogenous communities where the members of the community have a shared concept of what is good within that society forms a basis of allowing us to trust each other, for the most part, that we do have the same end goals even if we have different ideas of the best way to get there. Because the problem that we're dealing with right now is I'll talk to Joe Schmo in Seattle who just moved here from Russia or Hong Kong, 3 years ago, and he's got a way different idea of the society he wants to live in, has no interest in what my interests are or desires are. And so lying from a game theoretical angle makes perfect sense for him. There's no reason for him to reach common ground on me because his voting block and my voting block have no common ground. So establishing common ground within your society creates a foundation where all of the arguments that you made allusion to at the beginning about sunlight being the best disinfectant and all that can actually work. And in the meantime, where we are now, getting rid of free speech won't help us out of the trouble that we're in here. And I think that's pretty much the end of my argument. So now we can maybe get into some details.
Okay, I'd like to just respond to 2 points quickly.
Sure.
You made the point that rhetoric, or let's say humor, maybe in the form of mockery or whatever, these means can be used for good or bad, so to speak. It's like any weapon. You can use it for good or you can use it for bad. And I would say that that's true, but the relative advantage here is for bad, because the truth favors the good.
Yes.
Truth is a means that can be used, I wouldn't say only for good, but predominantly for good. If the truth is you're a bad person and you're not worth very much, the truth doesn't do you any good. But in general, the truth advances the good. Whereas, these kind of means like rhetoric and humor, which is can be a form of social coercion. They can be used for good or bad, and therefore, in comparison to the truth, relatively favor the bad. And so therefore advance the bad over and above what restricting people to the truth would do. Or let's say to truthful means of expression, because the truth itself is a very tricky thing to get a hold of. And so, we can't necessarily be certain that we have the truth or we know the truth, but we can be certain that there are truthful means of expression and untruthful means. And we can identify the untruthful means and prescribe them. And let's see, you made another point, which was that it's not going to help us to get out of the mess we are in right now. But I disagree with that, because I think there's a large extent to which the mess we are in is enabled and obscured by dishonest rhetoric. Like, it wouldn't even be possible without dishonest rhetoric. And as an example, take socialism. Socialism has made huge gains socially, politically, in every which way over the last 200 years. And there's an extent to which you could still have some socialism if you were limiting people to honest and truthful expression. If people were saying, hey, I can't produce much of value, but, if you throw me a little something, something, I at least won't fuck it up for everybody else. I at least won't cause too much trouble, or maybe I'll do something. Maybe I can serve in the military, and actually help to defend society and defend the producers to some extent, instead of parasitizing them. So there's an extent to which you can have a certain amount of socialism if people are being truthful. Now, if you took something like Marxist socialism and you stated that truthfully, it would be utterly untenable, because it would translate to something like, I'm an inferior person who can't produce much of value, and I resent everybody who can. And that's just something that's going to be totally unsympathetic if you restrict people to honest and truthful forms of expression and negotiation. So I think restricting people to honest and truthful means would clear the air of a lot of this stuff and make a lot of it, especially the worst forms of it, completely untenable. And that's something that's greatly to be desired.
Well, I would agree that it's greatly to be desired, but I think there's two counterpoints. First, there would be a great cost to this, and as great as it would be to rid ourselves of the dangers of Marxism, for example, there's a cost in the intrinsic enjoyment, first of all, of humorous banter and what might in political circles be rightfully called dishonest means of expression. And I'm also a little skeptical of whether dishonest means of expression can actually be banned. It's like if you could ban certain means, I'm sure, but the ability to present information dishonestly, it's kind of like the attempts of getting rid of bullying tactics in middle school and elementary school. The bullies are the socially savvy ones who know how to work the rules to their advantage to humiliate the younger people, and the less socially savvy ones. And so when schools put in more rules about what you are and aren't allowed to say to kids in terms of preventing bullies, it just gives the bullies more tools, and it is just confusing and takes away the teeth of the kids who are getting bullied. So I think that the better approach is, well, it's in the opening part of Aristotle's book on rhetoric, which is that we hold it a shameful thing for a man to be so weak that he cannot defend himself. And yet we don't have the same thing. We don't have the same opinion of a guy who isn't skillful enough and practiced enough in the art of using language and words to defend himself. And it was all the way back 2,000 years ago with Aristotle, when they were still trying to deal with the sophists and get rid of those assholes. Not promoting Marxism per se, but the same premise of dishonest speech proliferating and harming society. And it was in the face of that threat that Aristotle, one of the greatest minds of the West, said that even when it comes to rhetoric will tend, although it can be used for good or evil, it tends to favor the true position, because the best rhetoric will employ dialectic, even if it can point out failures and missing points in dialectic on the other side. It adds an extra variable. It adds an extra, something you have to learn, which is inconvenient. Why don't we all just learn dialectic and just go on that way? Well, maybe not all of us can learn dialectic, first of all. and second of all, it's impossible to get rid of the rhetorical flourishes. You might be able to try to stop some of the techniques, but they'll just work around you on the side. But then there's the practical problem of where we are today. People who would be in favor of establishing the sort of society that you and I would want to live in, are not the ones in charge of these things at the moment. We are our side, whatever that side is, is not the ones with the reins of power at the moment. And if we did have the reins of power, then our society would have such strong social consequences incurred that official restrictions wouldn't be necessary. It would be like, lying in our society would be, and being seen to lie in our society would be the equivalent of denying the Holocaust or calling someone a nigger in the society we live in at present. It's possible to do, but you pay a very, very heavy social consequence for it. And so, sorry, go ahead.
Well, you started off by saying it's not possible, or you don't think it's possible to suppress this stuff in a comprehensive way.
Not completely, no.
And I would agree with that point about, in a comprehensive way. But for example, it is possible to suppress Holocaust denial, and it's done in many countries to a very large extent.
Right.
And so there's not necessarily any practical challenge with extending that to other domains. As far as in a comprehensive way, the answer to that is the same answer that I would have, or proprietarians would have, to anything, and that is to go about it in a way described as incremental suppression. So you're not aiming to suppress it in a comprehensive way. You're aiming to start suppressing it with either the most egregious examples and work your way down the list, or, if you don't hold the reins of power, to start suppressing it in the ways that you can suppress it and work your way outward from there. And so whether you're approaching it from someone who's holding the reins of power or not holding the reins of power, there's an incremental way to go about it. Either, what can deliver the most benefit, or what, practically speaking, can you actually do at the moment. And you work outward from there, downward from there, until it stops being worthwhile, until you stop getting benefits that are worth the cost. And yeah, it's never going to be worthwhile to suppress, like, playful banter between friends or between couples, or whatever the case may be. Because, taking it down to that level, it's generally understood to be in good fun, and et cetera, et cetera. And there's just no benefit, certainly not correspondent with the costs. And so you wouldn't carry it down to that level. But for instances that are, let's say, high profile and of substantial import, social or political import, if you've got a professor who's filling hundreds of students' heads full of nonsense, that's a pretty egregious example, and it's something that could be tried. And there would be people with an incentive to try. If your kids are coming home from college spouting Marxist nonsense, that's a tremendous damage that's been done to an investment you've made in your progeny and your line, right? So that's a harm, that's a tort, that's a cause of action that you can take before a court and articulate. And it's as simple as working this into the common law, that this is a valid, actionable offense that can be punished under the common law.
Well, that's I guess a few points to bring up there. First of all, the intent of a law won't necessarily be the same as the effects of the law. For example, we could write a law with Marxism specifically in mind, but it could be used to say, well, no Marxist opinion on anything should be taken seriously. Now, there's something paradoxical about that when we consider the origins of the conception of free speech that we have in mind. In its original writing, the First Amendment did not mean what we think it means today when it talked about the freedom of speech. The freedom of speech, in its original conception, was a restriction against what's known as prior restraint, i.e. you could be imprisoned for saying something, but you could not be stopped from saying it. They could punish you afterwards, but they can't stop you from saying it. That was what was on the books. That was the understanding of the freedom of speech up until 1919, I believe, when Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes completely changed the meaning of the freedom of speech in the Abrams case. And he did this only a year and a half after the Schenck case, where he said that where the fire in a crowded theater argument came from. And he was, of course, sending a guy to jail for basically disagreeing with America's involvement in the First World War, saying that's analogous to, handing out pamphlets saying we shouldn't be fighting this war is analogous to shouting fire in a crowded theater. It's a clear and imminent threat that needs to be repressed. So there's room for it in the common law, but where did Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes get these ideas? He got them from two far left, one far left judge and another far left college professor, Learned Hand and Harold Lasky, respectively. And many of the foremost champions of freedom of speech in the early 20th century were Marxists as well. Rosa Luxemburg was one who comes to mind. And of course, the guy who got me into all of this, Christopher Hitchens, was once a Marxist. He sort of ditched them after a while. But so even Marxists, while wrong in their conclusions, may have something valuable to say here. And again, if we write the law saying, well, we're only going to stop things that pose a clear and present danger, who's going to judge what a clear and present danger is? For example, because most of the arguments against free speech are claims to harm, which is the case here. Would that include a guy handing out pamphlets saying we shouldn't go to war? I'm not saying that's what you're advocating for. I'm saying that seems to be the effect that most restrictions on free speech have, because once you put the tools out there, we're not necessarily in control of who uses them or how they're used. And they could just as easily come for us, and for pretty egregious thing. I mean, most of the censors are the sort of people who would ban 1984 for advocating fascism. That's the, so far as I can tell, that's the about summarizes the cognitive abilities and reading abilities of most of the people making these sorts of decisions. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Well, that's why I think it's necessary to specify that this be implemented under a system of common law, because that answers the question of who's going to decide what is a harm or what is prescribed speech, and that the answer is 12 people selected at random are going to decide with the assistance of a learned judge. And that's a system that's tremendously adaptable and flexible. It can adapt to changes in the techniques of parasitism or deception, because deception is just a specific case of parasitism in general. People engage in deception because they want to get something at a discount, right? Everybody who's lying is trying to steal something. Ultimately, that's the point of lying, is to carry out fraud,
right? Or
they're trying to destroy something. So it's either a fraud or a malicious harm of some kind.
Well, if they're trying to destroy something, then the purpose of the lie is to gain unearned trust, which is theft of a kind.
Sure.
Yeah.
But I would liken it to either let's say a kind of assault or a kind of theft, whatever the case may be. The common law is a system that's tremendously adaptable, can adapt to innovations in parasitic or deceptive behavior, and it's uncorruptible because you're drawing from the whole population to administer it. Practically uncorruptible. It's not completely uncorruptible, but to a much larger extent than other systems. So it's more adaptable, it changes quicker, it's more reliable and less corruptible than something like regulation, which is subject to regulatory capture, or legislation, which is subject to special interest politicking to a very high degree. A rule of law administered by judges and juries is much more robust than either of those approaches. And it also provides for the ability to, to provide some heterogeneity in legal norms and regimes, right? Because people are going to self-sort according to their values and preferences to be around other people who share similar values and preferences. And so if their values and preferences can't be enacted into law, or can't be enforced under the common law by judges and juries because there isn't substantial unanimity, then they're probably going to try to seek out a jurisdiction to live in where their preferences can be enforced in that way, reliably. And so you end up, there's an incentive for people to sort.
So you're advocating basically de facto secessionism in terms of like localized jurisprudence.
Yes.
Okay. Cool. Okay.
That's basically what it would amount to. Yeah.
Okay.
So the common law is, it's based on common principles, let's say, that can be shared across a wide area, but the local implementation can be very tailored to the particular preferences and norms and customs and traditions and values of those people in that particular location.
Okay. Well, I think I agree with that. I think what we're experiencing now in the United States and a lot of the problems we're experiencing, including with Marxism, are the product of, what you're talking about is people moving into self-selected homogeneous regions. And I think we had the opposite of that through even the 19th century, but also parts of the 20th. And I think that movement, that those patterns of migration and movement of people broke up what was a relatively homogeneous society in America that had
yes, or many homogeneous societies.
We had some German groups, and we had some more English, Anglo-Saxon, and some more Scottish areas for certain. But on the whole, there was a collectively held culture and a collectively understood idea of what our values were, what we thought the good was, and there was a legal precedent and jurisprudence that followed from that and was aligned with that for the most part. And common law already held a defense of free speech of a kind before the American Constitution was even written. It was sort of an unwritten precedent, but it was still there. And people didn't see a conflict between some of the very early prohibitions on, say, speaking out against the government. There were even prohibitions against making fun of the American military uniform or the flag. And people didn't really have a problem with that. There was no conflict between that and the experience of free speech that even some early writers like John Milton were writing about that time.
And of course, obscenity and pornography were banned until the mid-20th century.
Right. Pornography is a tricky one, but I personally don't see necessarily anything wrong with it. I know it when I see it precedent, because we all we all know the difference between high art and pornography, even if it's hard to define. You were mentioning honor cultures versus dignity cultures. Honor is an extremely difficult concept to define, maybe even undefinable, but that doesn't mean it's not real. And it's sort of a word game that people play when it comes to pornography versus art that depicts nudity of some kind.
And there was a precedent in free speech legislation or common law notions of free speech in the past for fighting words.
Yes.
Words that are considered to be a provocation to physical violence.
Them's fighting words. Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there's certain things you just don't want to say unless you're prepared to throw down.
Which is, well, in a long history of arguing with people that I like. I find myself in broad agreement. I guess much of our disagreement comes down to the language of is the policy that we kind of both share actually an expansion of or an attack on free speech? Because in my view, when you have a heterogeneous society, free speech becomes basically a threat to the social cohesion of that society. You kind of need to have laws against hate speech because, yeah, hate speech and expressions of divergent values from these different groups will cause tension and friction.
Those are fighting words. People
Exactly.
retaliate against those kind of speech expressions.
If I say Muhammad was not a prophet and was probably schizophrenic and a fraudulent, borrower of texts from other religious traditions,
and a brigand and a pedophile and everything else,
and a number of other things, that could get me. Those would be fighting words in much of the world, right? And over here, it could be the subject of a good cartoon, So.
And that could be another way to address this, is just to, expand the concept of mutual combat to the point where there are real physical consequences for crossing certain lines, verbally or otherwise.
That's not a bad idea, and I'm not advocating horseshoe theory here or anything, but there is something amusingly mirrored between the expansion of fighting words doctrine and what the left talks about with safe spaces and harmful speech and hate speech and so on, because words actually can cause concrete harm to other people. That's why we have libel laws. They've just taken it in a different direction, which is kind of amusing to think about. But ultimately, I don't think running, and here we can get back to disagreeing a little bit. I don't think running this common law program you're talking about, or trying to push for this or get precedent established, would be a good thing in a heterogeneous society. There's a saying in the legal world where tough cases make for bad law. And I think if you establish precedent within a heterogeneous society, you get legal precedent that is designed around heterogeneous societies. And I don't think heterogeneous societies are a good idea with or without free speech or restrictions on speech. But once you get the homogeneous society that we're talking about with these sort of self-segregated traditions of jurisprudence around self-selected precedents and preferences, then you can establish fighting words doctrine and perhaps group decisions against blasphemy, for example.
Well, there was a case not too long ago in Singapore where charges were brought against an edgy teenager for posting anti-Christian screeds online. And Singapore isn't even, a Christian nation, and I think the total number of Christians is something like 7%. But they pressed charges against this kid, basically just for disrupting the peace. For causing dissension or for posting things that could lead to conflict or disruption, disrupting the social harmony of Singapore, so to speak. And so it's not even necessary for the religion itself to be the predominant religion in an area or an official religion or anything like that in order for it to be protected by law under some kind of concept like this of fighting words or something like that.
Well, I have to say, despite being a Christian of sorts myself, I feel like laws against blasphemy, first of all, one of my favorite speeches online is Bishop Robert Barron talking about Thomas Aquinas and why the new atheists are right. Now, what the new atheists, Hitchens and Harris and Dawkins and so on, did, in Bishop Barron's view, is they did a phenomenal job of explaining what God theologically cannot be, what he isn't. And incidentally, according to Barron, there's actually a long Catholic tradition of the nature of God that isn't actually touched by any of the new atheist positions. But mockery was a great part of their campaign against religion generally, and Christianity perhaps in particular. And mockery helps to demonstrate the ridiculousness of some of those concepts, and it makes us perhaps better atheists, perhaps more theologically sound Christians or Muslims or whatever you are. I think it can be a valuable and strengthening thing. And while I'm perhaps happy to let Singapore do its own thing, the society I would want to live in would be one where things aren't, you know, if it's coming from someone that I trust, and if it's coming from someone who I am reasonably confident shares my goals and ideal of the good, then there shouldn't be anything that's off limits to that guy to criticize, so long as we're reasonably sure we're on the same trajectory. Because we don't necessarily know what the value or the harm, but sometimes harm comes from what we think at the moment is going to be valuable, and sometimes value comes from what we think might be harmful.
Well, Singapore isn't totally tolerant either. I mean, they have prohibitions on certain religions. Like, I think the Jehovah's Witnesses are totally banned from Singapore.
That's why Jehovah's Witnesses are the ones who are responsible for freedom of speech in schools in the United States, refusing the flag salute back in 1941.
Right, and some others as well. I can't remember all of them off the top of my head, but you know, you would have to make that determination, or a locale could make that determination, I think, what is worth tolerating and what isn't in that locale. And you know, there could be a wide variety of differences on that. You know, you could have some fairly tolerant and you know, freedom of religion type places, and some that are more like theocracies, and everything in between. So I think all of that can be legitimate, can be valid, as long as it's localized.
Sure.
Let's see. As far as what other substantive points do we need to get into before we conclude?
Well, maybe this isn't necessarily a point of disagreement, but a question on your opinion. It's to me, and this is why I capital H hate universities so much. They, to me, seem to be the place where genuine freedom of expression would be most important, while, I'm sorry, freedom of inquiry would be most important, and where the impositions against dishonest modes of speech, oh, this is kind of paradoxical, would also be most important. Universities would be the intersections of maximum freedom of inquiry in conjunction with maximum injunctions against dishonest modes of speech. And we seem to see the exact opposite.
So you would have maximum freedom, but also maximum discipline.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
Yeah, that is a little bit paradoxical, but not really, if you think about it.
Well, it's
kind of Burkean in a way, right?
Right. And it sounds idyllic, except you know, everyone's at work there all the time. There's no real place to relax. But it's not paradoxical because of that juxtaposition. It's paradoxical because the reality of universities is almost exactly the opposite. I've sat and listened to people with like double-digit letters after their names, MAs, PhDs, all this other shit, say things that are so transparently stupid and so poorly thought through and so undisciplined. It was mind-blowing. And at the same time, in the same place where people are maximally undisciplined, in the place where they should be maximally disciplined, they're it is almost the most restricted place when it comes to inquiry. There are only certain topics or certain directions you're allowed to explore certain topics in, especially in the realm of sociology, anthropology, and biology.
Universities promote vigorous exchange of idea, right?
Right. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on that or experience with that, or reasons as to why that might be the case.
I can only speculate on that point, and my guess would be something like the universities have been taken over by, essentially a Marxist cabal, not a conspiracy, per se in the explicit sense that they're all working together and confer in smoke-filled rooms, but more or less de facto, because they're working on a common purpose and common, out of common values. And
it's worse than a conspiracy.
It's an emergent conspiracy.
Yeah.
But I was just going to go back to something you said earlier about,
sure,
how Marxists in particular and leftists in general were often, the biggest proponents of freedom of speech in the past. And, I think that's true, especially when it was their filthy commie speech that was being protected by it, right?
The Trojan horse. Yeah.
But when they get in the door, when they take over the institutions and they have the institutional power, the minute they don't have to extend that freedom of speech to us, they don't. And so I understand the appeal of free speech, or going back to, the free speech we had a generation or two ago, now when we de facto don't have it. Like legally we do, but in practice, we don't really. I understand the appeal of going back to that and trying to defend that stronger. But that was, so their Trojan horse. That's what got them in the door. That's what got them in the institutions. That's what protected them from reprisals, from, firing and purges and blacklisting and everything else. But they're not going to offer us the same protections. They haven't offered us the same protections. They've denied us those protections specifically, explicitly. Mm-hmm. And, it's kind of irreciprocal to be extending them benefits that they won't extend to us. It's bearing a cost on their behalf when they would not bear a similar cost to us or extend a similar benefit to us. And so on that point, I would say, war to the knife, no quarter, no mercy. Do not give these people anything they won't give us, and they won't give us anything.
Well, the question is not how do we treat the enemy. The question is not how do we treat leftists. The question is what is the precedent we're establishing in treating ourselves. First Amendment and constitutional protections don't apply to non-citizens, and I don't believe they should apply to enemies of the state. Now, how you establish enemies of the state is a tricky question, and that's another careful and difficult situation to deal with. And I hate to quote Jordan Peterson, because I'm becoming increasingly convinced that Vox Dei is right about him fundamentally. But I do think that Jordan Peterson was right when he said that there will always be a snake in the garden. And that while we can make it difficult for Trojan horses to come in, we'll never be able to completely keep them out. And the better defense is to make the inside of our fortress as unfriendly to would-be invaders as possible. And that's not necessarily establishing restrictions on freedom of speech, because it's by free speech that we can make places inhospitable to our enemies as well, through mockery and ridicule and the weaponization of triggering leftists, particularly back in 2015 and 2016, really was fairly effective in making them go a little nuts, and making them feel depressed and like, oh, this isn't just your country, it's ours as well. And we're better off, And the cost of trying to prevent those Trojan horses will be putting restrictions on our own ability to defend ourselves as well.
Well, you've brought up this point several times of, setting a bad precedent, or, bad, extremes make bad law, or some stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I think
cases make bad law. Mm-hmm.
I think those are, or, lifeboat ethics would be another example of that. I think these are valid points, but the issue is we have a Marxist problem to deal with right now. Mm-hmm. And so we have to evolve a way of dealing with a Marxist problem. And then, once we don't have that problem, then we'll have a different problem or a different set of problems. But for right now, that's the problem we have. And, we'd love to get to Denmark and have the homogeneous society again, where we can make do with, much less restrictive standards of various kinds. And just do a lot more based on social trust and ostracism and peer pressure and stuff, and not even have to bother with law in a lot of cases. So we'd like that. We'd like the homogeneous society, but the fact is that right now we have a very heterogeneous society, and so that's the legal challenge that's facing us at the moment. And by the same token, it'd be bad to have a law code evolved for a heterogeneous society and a homogeneous society, because you'd have a lot of pointless restrictions.
Right.
And you'd have a lot of onerous enforcement that just really isn't necessary or helpful. But by the same token, if you're designing your law for a homogeneous society and you have a heterogeneous society, that's just as costly, because you don't have the needful restrictions in that case. So, I don't see any way out of this quandary except for some kind of dual morality, right? We have to adopt or evolve a dual morality, and maybe even a dual legal system, I don't know, or a legal standard, having to do with dealing with heterogeneous versus homogeneous cases. We want to get to the homogeneous case, and if we can do that through self-segregation or self-sortition, that would be maybe the least cost solution. But right now we're not in that case. We're in a very heterogeneous case. We've got a very different set of challenges. So those are kind of what we need to address right now.
Okay. So here's a crazy idea. How would you feel about something like strongly restrictive rules against free speech in the manner that you are describing at a federal level, and then have state law override federal law rather than federal law override state law?
That could work.
Yeah. Unfortunately, federal law is not going to give up its its power over states voluntarily.
Well, the trick would be not giving them the choice.
That would be the trick. Yeah. Well,
and that could be done.
I think we've basically wound up the whole debate. I think we're at a place where we've concluded that free speech is not dumb and not gay, but complicated. And especially in the predicament we're in here.
I'm still against it, and even if we get the homogeneous society again, I think there will need to be some limits, because, for example, we have the internet, and it's really exhausting dealing with certain types of people on the internet who are going to be there regardless, even if we can get them out of our actual communities. And, I just don't see any way.
That's what prostitutes are for. We just got to get them laid.
We have to innovate some kind of technological solution to this, whether it's legal or, maybe we need better social networks that allow people to self-segregate to a much larger extent. So that there's certain kinds of people, and I'm not just talking about certain kinds of individuals, I'm also talking about certain kinds of groups. And there's more than one of them. There's at least several that are just, to me, exhausting to deal with. It's cognitively demanding, it's emotionally draining, and I just do not like their rhetoric, and I wouldn't want to be part of any community that included them. But that extends to, let's say, online, right? I just don't want to have any contact with those kind of people. And so even if the solution, because law is a kind of technology, but even if the solution isn't a legal solution, I want some kind of solution so that I can insulate myself from those kind of people. And they definitely have to be insulated from my community and from my institutions, but even from, let's say, my media stream, or even from my social media. I want those people excluded out of my view, out of my mind. Maybe not completely, because I kind of want to keep tabs on them a little, but I don't want to deal with them a lot.
Okay, well that sounds like a technological problem beyond the law that we have now. But common law, I don't know how common law would interact with the internet. I imagine that's a problem we'll be seeing dealt with a lot over the next 10 years or so, especially if social media gets classified as an addictive item in the same way that gambling and heroin are. And I think we're moving in that direction. So it'll be interesting. Well, I don't know if we concluded this one way or another. I'm still not convinced that that freedom of speech is a bad thing or something worth restricting certain means of communicating, even though I've become a lot less of a hardliner on the subject over the years. So who knows? Maybe in a couple more years I'll be on your side. We'll have to see.
All right.
All right. Well, thanks for chatting, and I'm sure we'll talk more in the future.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.